Number 112 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Fisheries and Oceans. This meeting is taking place in a hybrid format pursuant to standing orders. Before we proceed, I would like to make a few comments for the benefit of our witnesses and members. Please wait until I recognise you by name before speaking and address all comments through the chair. Before we begin, I don't need to go through that. I think everybody's quite familiar now with the earpieces and where to lay them when you're not using them, and have your mic turned off when you're not using it. Keep your earpiece away from the microphones, of course. When you're not using your earpiece, place the face down on the sticker placed on the table purpose. Thank you for your cooperation. Pursuant to Standing Order 1082 and the motion adopted on June 16, 2022, the committee is resuming its study of population sustainability of Yukon salmon stocks. I want to say a welcome to our witnesses. Today we have from the University of Alaska Fairbanks, Mr. Peter Westley, Wakefield Chair of Fisheries and Ocean Sciences. From the Beaver Village Council, of course, we have Chief Rhonda Pitka and David Curtis, documentarian and fisherman. Thank you for taking your time to appear today. You will each have up to 5 minutes or less for opening statements. We'll start with Peter Westley, but I want to remind members as well, when we get to the rounds of questioning, please identify who you are asking the question to. It'll make things go smoother. So, Chief Pitka, you're up for 5 minutes or less, please.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought that you were asking Peter Westley to start first.
Skip down a line and then seeing your name. So forgive me for that. Mr. Peter Westley, 5 minutes or less, please.
Well, I always defer to Rhonda, but I'm happy to oblige. Good afternoon. Dr. Peter Westley. I'm an associate professor and Wakefield Endowed Chair of Fisheries and Ocean Sciences at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. I'm joining you today on the unceded homelands of the Lower Tanana Dene people, who for at least 11,000 years have stewarded these lands and waters on which the University of Alaska now resides. The Dene people have been and continue to be deeply connected with salmon that also call the Tanana River, which is a major tributary of the Yukon River here on the U.S. side. They call that river home. It's a privilege, an honor, and a responsibility that I take very seriously to share with you what I understand about the plight of salmon and salmon people in the Yukon. Bit of a background, I'm a Western-trained scientist. I have a Bachelor's of Science and a Master's of Science from the University of Washington School of Aquatic and Fishery Sciences. And I have a PhD in biology from Memorial University of Newfoundland. As a lifelong Alaskan, it's been a highlight of my life to live in St. John's. I lived there for 5 years. My son Finn was born in St. John's in 2010. And my time there really underscored the vital importance of the best available science to make informed fisheries decisions and policies. And here in Alaska, as a professor, I teach some of those heart-wrenching lessons that were learned from the collapse of northern cod. I am arguably more concerned or as concerned with the ongoing declines of Chinook salmon in the Yukon as I think people were in Newfoundland in the early 1990s. The situation is absolutely as grave. The causes of the declines are complex and complicated. They occur at different scales across time and space, and they all operate in the context of a changing climate. So I am here. I'm happy to field questions. I'm so glad for the invitation. I ultimately urge a focus on research along avenues that are actionable, where we as people have some hope of actually making a difference for salmon in our lifetime. I think it's really easy as researchers for us to propose and to do really good science, really good salmon science, but that really may not be good for the salmon or good for the salmon and people. And I think we really need to prioritize that. So I would urge you to keep your eyes on the science that really is likely to make a difference. So thank you again for the invitation. I look forward to the questions and the conversation, the discussion, to speak towards this really vital and ongoing crisis.
It's short on time, but that's good. We'll save that up, and along the way, somebody will use it, I'm sure. We'll now go to Chief Rhonda Pitka for opening statement of 5 minutes or less, please.
Good morning. I'm Rhonda Pitka. I'm Chief of the Village of Beaver. I've been Chief of the Village since about 2011. Beaver is a small, remote fly-in community. I'm also Chairwoman of the Council of Athabascan Tribal Governments. We're a consortium of 9 tribal governments in the Yukon Flats area of Alaska. I sit on the Yukon River panel, and I'm a federal subsistence board member. Our people have relied on Chinook salmon for a millennia. We've had difficulty in finding food before, but it's never been to this degree. Our food security has become so imperiled. We live in an area where the moose density is much lower, and our people have traditionally relied on moose and salmon for the majority of their diets. I can't even begin to tell you the pain that the people on the river have felt for the last 5 years as the salmon stocks have dwindled lower and lower and lower. Our conservation of the salmon has cost us thousands of dollars and thousands of hours in time, in advocacy, in man hours, in policy. We've learned so many things about ocean science that I never thought that I would need to know as a fisherwoman on the Yukon River. The vast majority of our people depend so heavily on the Yukon River salmon as not only a source of food, but as a source of culture, that the crashes have devastated our communities in a lot of different ways. I've testified before that we've seen incredible rises in the rates of prediabetes, to the point where when they've started to do regular testing in our clinics, the numbers are upwards of 70% of those tests coming back as pre-diabetic. As our people are no longer allowed their traditional and cultural use of salmon and access to things that have provided health and wellness for our people, we've seen so many different social effects that have happened with the dwindling of the resources. It's been so difficult to see the rises in domestic violence. You can see the data yourself when you look at it, the rises of domestic violence, prediabetes, all of these numerous effects, not only nutrition-wise, but spiritually, that people have suffered. The backbone of our communities is often the traditional salmon fishery. We've always felt like we've never had to voice these ideas in this particular way before in our advocacy, and it's been really difficult for our people on the ground to sit back and not fish for the last 5 years. Right now, we're going into this 7-year moratorium, and on top of the already 5 years, that would be 12 years total of not fishing for Chinook on the Yukon River, and it's already been devastating to our people, and it's going to continue to devastate our people. I think in my last testimony, I spoke briefly about the effects of the trawl fishery on the ecosystem for our people, and the fact that conservation has always been balanced on the backs of the people in the upper Yukon River and Canada. We have so much empathy for our relatives on the Canadian side of the border, because they've faced much longer declines in the salmon than we have, and it's devastating to watch them struggle through that also. Many of our children have not fished in their lifetimes, and I'm concerned now that some of our elders won't be able to fish within the rest of their lifetimes too. The devastation of the Yukon River salmon fishery has been so detrimental to the health and wellness of our people. And at the same time, we can watch our governments do things like subsidize the commercial salmon fishery by buying commercial salmon under food programs instead of maybe finding more sustainable ways to fish for salmon themselves. Instead, they place the onus and the burden of conservation on the backs of the Indigenous people of the Yukon River. I'd like to thank you all for inviting me again. I was so worried in my last testimony that I probably offended most of the Canadian House of Commons that I would never be invited back. I thank you all so much for your time today. I appreciate it.
Not a problem. We'll now go to Mr. David Curtis for 5 minutes or less, please.
Hello, my name is David Curtis, and I'm joining you today from the traditional territories of the Trondek-Wichan First Nation, on whose lands I have had the honor to live for the past 27 years. I first worked as a field technician on a number of salmon studies within the Klondike region in the early 2000s. This work brought me into direct contact with salmon and their environments. For example, one of my tasks was snorkeling down the Klondike River to assess male to female ratios, bringing me within centimeters of living salmon. My passion for all things salmon has only increased since those days. I later became involved with salmon as a food source when I acquired a commercial fishing license. Unfortunately, this coincided with the tail end of a viable Chinook fishery. When it closed in 2010, I shifted my efforts to harvesting fall chum and developed a small business sustainably fishing them for local consumption. Fishing allowed me to remain engaged with salmon while helping address food security in the face of climate change. Sadly, with the catastrophic collapse of the chum run in 2020, I haven't been able to harvest any salmon for over 4 years. Many important points have been raised and eloquently addressed by previous witnesses, especially regarding the possible causes of the decline of Yukon River salmon. I will not repeat these, but instead focus on issues regarding the human-fish interface that often goes unaddressed, yet are the very things we can do something about, such as fishing practices, in particular commercial fishing. When considering the decline of the Yukon River salmon, a lot of energy and resources continue to be expended on contributing factors we have little or no short-term control over. Climate change, diseases, increasing water temperatures, salinity, changes in the ocean food chain, etc. Amongst these worthy conversations, little is said about the history, evolution, and cumulative impacts commercial fisheries have had along the river, gear, and techniques used. There can be no denying that the cumulative effects of previous harvest practices have had detrimental impacts, not only on the number, but also, and probably more importantly, the quality of fish making it to the spawning grounds. From the 1840s until now, there has been some form of a commercial fishery in the Yukon River. Over this time, distinctly different management regimes have evolved between Yukon and Alaska. One thing they share is the commercial fishers' desire to maximize their yield in relation to management decisions. Commercial fishing has often been practiced without direct concern for long-term impacts on the resource, at least not until returns approach the tipping point of potential extirpation. The Atlantic cod fishery, amongst others, is an excellent example of how conventional management regimes, based primarily on commercial fishing interests, have failed the very resource they are set up to protect. With this in mind, I'd like to stress that it has been known for quite some time that there is a direct correlation between the type of gear used by commercial fishers to target specific age groups for size, weight, and sex that, if left unregulated, will lead to the demise of the resource. I quote from C.E. Walker's 1976 study of Yukon salmon for Environment Canada's Fisheries and Marine Services, in which he raises concerns about the potential extinction of Chinook salmon. Remember, this is 1976. And quote, "A change towards heavier use of gill nets, particularly with larger size mesh, will increase the catch of female Chinook salmon. This has two advantages to the fishermen. It increases the weight of catch and provides roe, which in itself has high value on the market. Increased exploitation of female Chinook salmon may threaten the salmon population with extinction." End quote. Communities along the upper portion of the river, along with scientists and activists, have, for decades, been sounding the alarm about how Chinook salmon are on the precipice of extinction. They've called for commercial harvesting practices, especially in the fishery at the mouth, to be changed if a total collapse is to be averted. While I am in total support of the Indigenous-led initiative for a moratorium on harvesting of Chinook for one full life cycle, I hope this will be accompanied by plans to conduct low and no harm monitoring studies of the run for the duration of the moratorium. The moratorium, while being important unto itself, provides a rare opportunity to conclusively determine whether harvesting practices have negatively impacted the Chinook runs. Even though this moratorium impacts my ability to harvest fish for my community, any personal loss this represents is dwarfed by the massive sacrifice this entails for every community along the Yukon River. I am hopeful this agreement and your work on this study and its recommendations signals a shift in management policies towards ones which integrate both traditional and scientific practices to increase the health of the salmon population and in turn all the people who live along the Yukon River. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that. Before I go to questions, I want to mention that, of course, we want to welcome Mr. Green back to committee from the NDP party, and Mr. Currick and Mr. Epp, who seems to have lost some weight, for the Conservative Party. But I'm sure he'll be recognised somewhere along the way. We'll now go to our questions. Again, I'd like to remind questioners to identify who your question is to, and we'll go to Mr. Arnold. Mr. Perkins, Mr. Arnold first for 6 minutes or less. And yes, I knew Mr. Epp would show up sooner or later. Thank you, Mr. Epp. You're just in time.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I believe I'll start with Mr. Curtis. It sounds like you've done a lot of field work with salmon and other species, possibly. I'd like to touch base on, the evolution of species and natural selection, where it's often the weakest that are taken out of the group by predators and so on, leaving the strongest to survive. We've heard how there used to be large Chinook salmon, 70 to 90 plus pounds in that system. The benefits of those larger females laying more eggs and larger, healthier eggs. What do you see has happened in the system in your time there?
From my time fishing and also working as a habitat technician, and also from the history of other fishers that I've talked to on both sides of the border, there has been a continuing decrease in the size and weight of the fish returning, at least onto the Canadian side of the border. This has a number of different reasons, I think, but one of the potential ones that is really important to keep in mind is the targeting of large fish through large mesh nets for decades at a time, which scientifically is proven to be detrimental to the health of a run. As you mentioned, the larger fish, the more fecund the fish, the better the returns. Also, a thing to understand as well, as many people pointed out, this is a very long system. The Yukon River itself, the salmon run is over 3,000 kilometers. Some of these fish go. You need large fish to make the return that far up the river. It's just only really makes sense. The larger the fish, the more reserves it has, the more muscle mass it has to be able to make that long journey. So I hope that answered your question.
That leads to the next question. What could be done to ensure those large fish make it through if and when, I will say when because I believe in being positive about this, when stocks are returned to abundance, how can we ensure those large fish that are important to the evolution and the continuation, sustainability, how can we operate to make sure that happens?
Yes, that's a very good point and a good question, and it's one that I think really comes down to management, rigorous management programs that consider the mesh size, the fishing techniques, lengths of nets and things like that used throughout the fishery. I mean, I'm speaking primarily to commercial fisheries, but I think as well, all fisheries should be considering this as part of moving forward We have a moratorium now, which I think is a fantastic move towards rebuilding the stocks. But as I said in my opening statements, I think it's also an incredible opportunity to understand better what these fishing practices have had over time on this run, and possibly work towards rectifying that. There are a number of different ways that could be done, but the key one here, I think, is just having a really solid understanding of that relationship between mesh size and the way in which it targets specific size fish, and how that needs to be managed in a way in which we no longer do that. So smaller mesh nets is one way of doing that.
Okay, just if I can quickly,
fishing. Sure.
If I can quickly,
Yeah.
I want to get on to another question as well.
Sure. My apologies.
The mesh size now, is that in reference to in-river or marine fisheries, or both?
That's in reference to in-river specifically, is what I'm talking about.
Okay,
Particularly, yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. I'd like to move on now to Chief Pitka. Chief, you've mentioned that food security is becoming a challenge. 7 years without, or more now, without salmon is certainly concerning. What plans have been put in place, or what work has been done to replace the loss of harvested salmon for your people?
One of our largest nonprofits, regional nonprofits in our area, Tanana Chiefs Conference, has donated hundreds of thousands of dollars of salmon to our area from Bristol Bay. So they're sockeye salmon. So oftentimes they would come in and we would have these whole frozen salmon. So that's one thing that they've done. I'm not sure how well you know the state of Alaska system right now, but within the last year or so, they've had backlogs of up to 8 months for review of the food assistance programs, the SNAP program that they operate. So there have been people that haven't even been able to access food cards at the state of Alaska. We've tried numerous ways to contract some of those programs and make sure some of those processes work better for our people, but that's not a really great long-term solution to fly in fish from other areas, and it's not sustainable for a lot of our people. The freight costs in our area are pretty outrageous. It's upwards of 50 cents a pound, and even if you have 5 sockeye salmon, they're at minimum 15 pounds a piece. So it can be very, very expensive and very, very unwieldy to fly in salmon, especially to people that are very used to fending for themselves and taking care of themselves and being able to, I guess, fish for themselves.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Arnold. We'll now go to Mr. Hanley for 6 minutes or less, please.
Thank you. I want to first thank all three of you for coming. I hope to have questions for each of you. Chief Pick, congratulations on your niece's graduation and welcome back to the committee. You're certainly welcome. I want to start with Mr. Curtis. David, you and I have had many salmon conversations over the last couple of years. I want to allow you to talk about specifically chum salmon and the significance of the collapse, perhaps a more recent collapse of the chum fishery, how we may have maybe overlooked that somewhat in our focus on Chinook salmon, but also the interplay, the effect on the overall ecosystem and the interplay between chum salmon and Chinook salmon survival and sustainability.
Yes. Thanks for that question. Chum salmon are something that I feel very passionately about as well. There was a collapse in 2020 from one year to the next where approximately 13% of the run returned of the 10-year average. And that was a very serious and catastrophic collapse that hadn't happened essentially within a 1-year cycle. That continues. The chum have not recovered in any way that to my understanding, maybe sitting at 19%, I think was the highest of the returns that came across the border. The chum are often overlooked because they're not traditionally as important a food source. They were harvested a lot for dog teams in the past. I did a lot of work in the early 2010s, on to bring it back to it as a table food within our community as a local wild protein source. They're also very, very important, as you mentioned, MP Handley, to the environment. The thing that gets often overlooked, but Chief Pitka brought up, which I've really appreciated, is that the entire ecosystem depends upon these salmon coming back, both Chinook and chum and coho, for their health and well-being. And this is a watershed which is estimated to be 25% larger than the province of Alberta or the state of Alaska. It's a massive ecosystem that has depended upon these salmon for its health and well-being forever. And to have these species go extinct in such short order I am sure will have devastating knock-on effects for the environment. And that's something that causes me great concern for the future generations.
Thank you for that. And hopefully I'll come back to you later. I just want to move to Professor Wesley for a couple of minutes. And I wanted to ask you, Professor Wesley, very interesting that you're drawing a parallel, not a surprising one, between the Atlantic cod fishery collapse. Can you elaborate a little more on where you see us potentially going with the Yukon River salmon vis-a-vis the history of the Atlantic cod fishery? Where might be the points of intervention that can prevent this happening? You sound not very optimistic, and I wonder where we can usefully intervene at this point.
No, I really appreciate that question, and I think it was MP Arnold that was saying wanted to stay optimistic. I too try to remain optimistic, but you also need to be realistic. And my opinion has continued to change as the evidence has continued to change and as the runs have continued to decline. 10 years ago, I probably would have given you a different answer on where I think things are at. And so I'm gravely concerned. I'll just start off by saying some of the parallels that I see in broad strokes between northern cod and salmon. I mean, there was at the time questions about whether the collapse of cod was a climate story, whether it was an overfishing story, and there were different views of the world. And of course, like the answer to that is that it was the interaction between the two, and that the fishery vastly overharvested northern cod by number, but also the diversity of those cod was greatly reduced. And we've been talking about that. And so be clear for the Chinook story in particular, that as the numbers have gone down, so too has the size, the numbers of eggs, the size of eggs, the depth to which females can dig nests, all these things that are tied to things that we think are influencers of productivity and survival. And so a lot of that diversity had been lost, and that in the context of a changing climate, which Newfoundland is always cold, and it got really cold in the early 1990s, that the cod stock then did not have the built-in resiliency and diversity to withstand that shifting environment, and it led to a collapse. And I think that there is something to that in terms of the parallelism here, that we do have a changing climate, and it's undeniable, it's a fact. And we have lost the numbers, and we have lost the quality, the size, and so that is a huge component of concern. So what can we do around that? I mean, it's came up in a bit of the previous question around natural selection and so forth. I mean, some of the real challenges are that we know that the age and size at which salmon mature is in large part controlled by genetics, that there's environmental controls on that, but there's also a genetic control. And for a Chinook salmon to be really big requires them to spend a lot of time in the ocean, and that there is some genetic control over when fish decide to mature, right? They're not cognitively thinking it through, but they are, genetic programmed of when, given size and age, they will transition to become mature. And partly because of,
Thank you
absolutely.
for that. We're going a little bit over time. I have to move on. We'll now go to Madame Debienne for 6 minutes or less, please.
Merci.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you to the witnesses for being here today. It's always very valuable to hear you. I'll carry on with Mr. Wesley, who was talking about issues of the run, but also a series of factors that have led to the state the fisheries in today. To what extent can the Minister of Fisheries and Oceans, or has the Minister of Fisheries and Oceans in past years truly understood what you're explaining today? You're saying that it's a collection of factors that have combined to bring us to where we are now. To what extent does the Minister, or has the Minister of Fisheries and Oceans responded, or has the Minister responded at all?
Thank you for that question. And also, I will be more punctual. I didn't realize there's a 6-minute response time, so I'll talk faster. So I think there has been a response, and the response has been, as the stocks have declined in abundance, there has generally been a decrease in harvest and more increasing restrictions that is consistent with our basic understanding of fisheries management, that if there is not a surplus of individuals beyond what is needed for the spawning stock to replace themselves, that can be harvested. And as the stock goes down, the harvest needs to be restricted. And so there's absolutely been responses. I think that the question before us now is that has already been done in river, and to Chief Pitka's point, that conservation has been on the back of the local people. They've been doing that. So, and that still seems to not be working. The salmon stocks are still declining. So I think the question before us is, what do we do in addition to those other tools before us? What is in front of us? And I would say turning our attention to other sources of mortality beyond what's happening in the river, what's happening in the ocean that we might have some control over. And the ones that come to mind are things that have been brought up. Bycatch by commercial fisheries is part of. It is not the only, it is part of this conversation, to the point where you have to be big and old to go that far up the river. If the ocean is much more dangerous now because of things like bycatch, that's a problem. And we have some control over that. We also know that, ironically, there's a lot of other salmon in the ocean right now, other species of salmon that are competing with Chinook salmon and chum salmon for food. We have some control over how many fish are in the ocean, partly because of our commercial fishing practices, but more importantly by the release of these fish from hatcheries that we have control over. So that's my point about actionable things, that what pieces of the system do we have an ability to respond to, continuing to think about bycatch and other sources of mortality in ocean fisheries, also the hatchery releases. And I would also add to the list, more and more evidence is pointing to the role of the resurgence of marine mammal predators and other predators in the ocean, that the ocean apparently has become much more dangerous than it used to be in recent times than it used to be. And we need to think about the things that we can do to respond to that.
Monsieur le Président, j'ai malheureusement pas mis mon...
Mr. Chairman, I need to be disciplined. Do I have any time left? Great. I will continue with Mr. Curtis. Mr. Curtis, I can tell you that we're seeing the same thing happen in Quebec. A number of species are declining, and there's a lack of predictability from Fisheries and Oceans Canada. The department did sound the alarm. Actually, we sounded the alarm to the department. Quebec Fishers said we need to open the redfish fishery, and many other species seem to be disappearing from the St. Lawrence. Cod has been decimated by seals. So what can we do to stop the decline and return to some kind of foundation so that we can change the direction in which this is going? How can we stop the decline and reverse it?
Yes, thank you for that. You brought up many good points. Just quickly, I think the First Nations initiative of the moratorium for a one life cycle currently of Chinook is a really important part to taking action. That is something that I believe is well overdue, and I look forward to seeing how that impacts the run and what we see, how that impacts the run over the coming 7 years. But I think also there are definitely there's work to be done about raising awareness of this part of the world and the salmon and the role they play both culturally and also in regards to food security within the whole length of the Yukon River. I very much agree that more work needs to be done as well in terms of controlling overfishing and also looking at environmental conditions within our oceans. The bycatch that was mentioned before, in the year 2020, when the collapse of the chum fishery happened, the official reported bycatch from NOAA for chum salmon just in the Pollock fishery alone was 560,000 fish. That's bycatch. That's fish that are mulched essentially and thrown overboard. They don't return to the environments in which they originated from. We don't know exactly where those fish originated from. They could be from all sorts of different places. It's estimated to go back to the notion of fish hatcheries and the impacts of other fish, hatchery fish coming out. There's somewhere in the area of 5 billion pink and chum hatchery fish released throughout the North Pacific every year between Russia, Canada, US, Japan, and South Korea. I don't know if that number is exact, but those types of impacts definitely need to be studied and understood better and controlled. High seas fisheries, ghost ships, factory vessels out there fishing with massive trawlers.
Thank you, Mr. Curtis.
Incredible technology.
We're going over time here. We'll now go to Mr. Green for 6 minutes or less, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And again, it's indeed an honor and privilege to be back at this committee. I'll have to admit off the top that I'm here sitting in for my colleague, Lisa Marie Behrens from the West Coast there. I myself am a Great Lakes guy out of Hamilton. But I wanted to pick up on the questions from the previous speaker, particularly around the moratorium. And this question is to Chief Pitka. Since your appearance at this committee in February, the U.S. have signed the 7-year moratorium on the Yukon Chinook, and it's been called monumental, a huge step forward. But there's also been some concerns that perhaps it's too little too late. And you yourself voiced concerns about consultation. So I want to give you an opportunity to reflect on that. You had suggested that, quote, it was just thrown at you. How could the consultations have been done better?
Well, the consultations could have started earlier in the process. I think the agreement was also thrown at the Yukon River panel, so it wasn't just the Indigenous tribes in Alaska. We felt like we were very left out of that particular decision making, and we also felt like you were correct. It is too little, too late, and that since we've had 5 years of no fishing on the Yukon River, none of the runs have come back. So there are other factors at play here, and we wanted to explore those more. Thank you very much.
I want to give you the opportunity now, if you could, just reflecting on that process and how you were essentially left out. What would you have said if you were consulted?
I would have said that I want stronger protections on the cultural use of the cultural fishing of salmon for potlatch and ceremonial purposes. I also would have said that we've had 5 years of no fishing with very little success on bringing that run back. And you know, through my work on the Yukon River panel, we've learned through the years that when we've had those really large runs return to the spawning grounds, were also years that we've had a full subsistence fishery. So just based on that, you know, on those factors, it just doesn't seem like it's going to be a very effective tool. We've had over at this point 15 years or so of restrictions on net size so that we can escape those larger salmon. We've had all of these different conservation methods every single year, and none of it has made as much of an impact as we would like. I've heard this run referred to as they want more salmon on the spawning grounds because it's like putting money in the bank, but these are natural ecological systems that are very complex. And it's not a very good analogy, but I understand how people who don't have backgrounds in fisheries can try to simplify those terms in ways that they can understand, which is you know, I get it, but at the same time, it's simplifying a very complex system in a way that doesn't quite relate to reality. And I would have also said that the only reason that there is the amount of knowledge that we have on that particular run and the accuracy of that knowledge is because of those Indigenous fishermen in the state of Alaska who have fished that river their whole lives, who have voluntarily given Indigenous knowledge to the state of Alaska to manage those runs.
Have you in that panel had the ability to provide submissions? Forgive me, I'm subbing in at this committee. So have you provided either this committee in past iterations or through the American Counterpart Committee direct recommendations on what you'd like to see out of this?
Yes. So, you know, the panel process is a bilateral process with the United States and Canada. So the United States has their own particular agenda and how they wish to run that.
Okay.
And by the United States, I really mean the state of Alaska. Sorry.
Sure. Could I ask that maybe for the benefit of this committee, you forward those recommendations for consideration at this committee at the report writing stage?
Okay.
And I just want to make sure that it's clear and on the record, because I think I heard you say this, but I would love for you just to explicitly state whether or not you think this agreement will support the recovery of the Yukon Chinook.
I think that there are a lot of good things in that particular report, but some of the things feel like a little bit too little too late. And I don't think that stopping the subsistence fishery, if there's a harvestable surplus, is going to bring back that run to what it used to be without any further limits on the bycatch of salmon in the ocean.
My colleague, I think, referenced in her notes for me that you had an exchange with her, and I believe that what you'd stated, it was less than 1% of statewide harvesting. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct. That came from, I forgot to mention my source to her at our last committee meeting, but that was actually from the State of Alaska website on subsistence. So 1% of the total take is subsistence related.
I'll likely come back to this same line of questioning to you, Chief, at my next round. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Green. We'll now go to Mr. Perkins for 5 minutes or less, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I say, MP Green, that was pretty good for a guy from Lake Ontario. And we have a fellow Lake Ontario conservative, Lake Erie. Sorry, I shouldn't mix up the lakes. Lake Erie member here, and Mr. Epp. I'd like to start perhaps with Dr. Wesley. I believe I heard in your opening that you said that we need to focus on science that will make a difference. So I guess am I to draw two things? One is we haven't done science that makes a difference with regard to the Yukon salmon. And two, what would that exactly be that's not being done now?
Yeah, thank you for that. We have done a lot of really good science, and we have learned a lot about the ecology, the biology, diseases, migration. I mean, we have learned a lot, and we have done a lot of good science. My point is science that helps inform decision-making around things that are actionable is what is needed. So my point is we know that there are a lot of hatchery fish being put into the ocean. That's a fact. Science that can better understand if we change the number of hatchery fish that are put into the ocean, what is the effect you would likely have on the growth of Chinook, the survival of Chinook, to help inform the decisions of how many less fish or what fish should be released into the ocean, right? That's a complex question, but science can help inform essentially the trade-offs of if we do this, what are we likely to get from that decision? And so science that helps inform trade-offs and decision-making is what I mean by actionable science. That is really important science. So work that, I think to David Curtis's point, science that is really good for helping understand salmon ecology, biology, while fascinating and important, may not provide the levers for us to pull to make a difference, if that makes sense, sir.
Just a little more precision, but I think it's there. I think I've got it both between what Mr. Curtis said and what you're saying. That when we've heard this from other testimony, it's shocking the amount of farmed hatchery, whatever you want to call it, commercially bred pink and chum are being thrown into the ocean, particularly by other countries that I don't think we have control over. There's only so much food, right, for salmon. So if you overpopulate one, it's obviously going to be an environmental impact on the other. Is that some of the science you say we don't have?
No, thank you for that. And it's, again, as the facts have changed, our minds need to change. Our opinions need to change as the weight of evidence changes. When I was studying fisheries 20 years ago, the ocean was really taught still as a black box. We don't know what goes on in the ocean. And there was not evidence at the time, really, that the ocean was limiting in terms of the amount of food. It stands to reason that there's always limits in nature, right? But we did not really have the evidence to say that the ocean has a capacity and that we are close to it. And now the evidence is that we are at that limit and sometimes past it, and the capacity is changing. The other thing, so yes, you are right. The hatchery fish from other countries are a huge part of this complex issue. But let us not kid ourselves, too, that 60 million or so Bristol Bay sockeye salmon that are all wild are also sharing that ocean, right? There are a lot of wild fish as well that are part of this, but we have more direct control on the hatchery. So this is not to villainize hatcheries. It's the fact that we have control over that, and we can use science to inform those decisions of how we should be reforming what we do with hatcheries.
Testimony here from earlier witnesses that over the last number of years, there's actually been little to no DFO CNP enforcement on the river, no matter what the rules were. Is that something you, as somebody who spent a lot of time studying this river and this situation, have seen as well? Oh, Mr. Curtis?
Sorry, I thought you were addressing that to Dr. Wesley. Commercial fishers on the Canadian side and First Nations fishers have complied with, I think, very well to DFO management regulations and efforts at conservation, especially since I've been involved in the fishery from the early 2000s. Prior to that, I can't really speak with any authority on it, but I think the fishers on this side of the border have worked hand in hand and followed conservation efforts that have been brought to us by DFO and by managers. There hasn't been a lot
I
of
get that. I
presence
just
on
wanted
the
to make
river.
sure about DFO, not about
Time is
the
up.
harbor.
Time is up. We're going over. We'll now go to Mr. Hardy
Sorry.
for 5 minutes or less, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to start off, I guess, with, excuse me, Chief Pitka. The moratorium, it's for 5 years with no fishing on the Yukon River. Is that correct?
No, it's 7 years.
7 years, okay.
If we don't make a statement of 71,000 on the Yukon River.
7 years, no fishing on the river. When we spoke about this at one of our previous sessions, I believe it was Chief Frost that provided the answer. We asked the question, what about at the mouth of the river? What about out in the ocean before the fish reach the river? And the term she used was abundant. So it suggests that we could do an awful lot, to control fishing up and down the Yukon. But if the fish are being intercepted before they make it to the river, then we have a big problem. Professor Wesley, would that be your take as well?
It stands to reason that if fish are being caught before they get to the river, they're not going to make it further upstream and to the spawning ground. So absolutely. I mean, the real point is in these times where there's real scarcity, fish are struggling, populations are struggling to have enough spawners such that they are able to produce enough offspring to replace themselves. It is true that functionally every fish matters. It is also similarly true, if I may, it's also similarly true that every fish that is caught in a bycatch or intercepted might not make it back to the river itself. And so there's some truthisms on all of the parts here, right? That's why there is accounting for where the fish would have been going using genetics, also taking into account that if it was a young fish, that fish might not have been maturing this year or even next year to do the accounting of how many would actually have made it back. So there's complications on the end, but all I know is that, and I think people would agree here, that in these times of real crisis, every fish that didn't make it back to the river is a real loss. And we need to get real serious about trying to ensure every fish.
In testimony in various studies over the years, and some of us have been on this committee for a few years, we've skated over the issue of the Alaska fishery and the process by which Alaska fishers intercept a lot of fish headed to British Columbia, Washington State, perhaps even Oregon. And now, with evidence that that intercept is potentially one of the difficulties salmon are facing on the Yukon River, what can you say about the state of Alaska's management of the ocean fishery?
I guess what I would say is that all fisheries at some level, I would say all fisheries at some level are mixed stocked fisheries. So even within the river, you get different populations that are mixed up heading upriver. In the ocean, it gets bigger and harder and messier. And what I would say is my biggest concern, someone who's trained in fisheries and understands, and I'm a lifelong Alaskan, and so I try to find and take pride in the successes that Alaska has had in fisheries. My biggest concerns for Alaska and fisheries in Alaska and management are on the large-scale marine fisheries that are inherently mixed stocks of other areas, other places of Alaska, other countries. Those are the fisheries that I have the most concern about. And I think those are the ones that are causing Alaska big issues, and I think they need to be put under the microscope more. I don't know what else to say.
Thank you for that. Mr. Curtis, based on your observations, et cetera, have we basically fished the big fish to extinction? That all we're left now is the genetics to produce smaller fish?
I would say with current data and the current situation, yes. I am hopeful, though, that with the 7-year moratorium, we might see some returns of some of these larger fish. There was in 2000, and I believe 8 at Rampart Rapids, a study that when there was a closure at the fishery at the mouth and along the river, commercial fishing, that the size of salmon escaping up that area was proven to be considerably larger, more females. These are numbers that are readily available through the study that was done. I think it's an example of possibly where we need to go with the moratorium and to do low to no harm monitoring of what happens over these 7 years to see about those impacts. I stay focused on that because that is, really where my experience lies, and on this river in this region, and on this side of the border. And so I'm hopeful, but yeah, it's not looking good.
Thank you, Mr. Hardy. We'll now go to Madame Debian for 2.5 minutes or less, please.
Thank you, Chair. 2.5 minutes for one question, I think. Mr. Curtis, could you please tell us, since you were talking about processing vessels, large processing vessels, or was it Professor Wesley who talked about them? Overfishing. I don't remember which of you mentioned it, but you talked about processing vessels. We had them for redfish, for the redfish fishery. It's something that really concerns us because that's what brought down the biomass 30 years ago. These massive factory boats are out in the water again, and we're beginning to wonder whether they're not more interested in the bycatch than in the redfish. Many, many species are at risk, including salmon. Our factory boats, this modern way of fishing, should we be reviewing how we fish in general? Mr. Curtis or Mr. Wesley?
I'll just take a second to say absolutely. I think so. And on both, as I've mentioned on the river, but also on the ocean, and new technologies, new fishing techniques, both provide for the ability to better target species for fisheries in mixed fisheries, and prevent bycatch. But at the same time, it also increases the efficiency of the catch. So that has long-term impacts. We're also facing fisheries on the high seas that these fish know no boundaries, as has been mentioned. They're mixed stocks, and there's fish heading into open water, high seas where we have no controls, and there are many, many fisheries that are happening out there which we have no data from and have no control over as well. So I think the high seas, and there's been some commentary about this, both scientific and legal, that there needs to be some consideration given for international agreements to better manage fisheries and or eliminate fisheries in the high seas and keep fisheries within exclusive economic zones so that each country can properly manage these impacts that you're talking about.
Thank you, Madam Debian. We'll now go back to Mr. Green again for 2.5 minutes or less, please. And Mr. Green, if you could raise the boom on your mic, the translators are looking for a much clearer sound from you.
Okay. How's that? I normally lower the boom. I don't raise it, but here we go. Is that better? Mr. Chair, I want to confirm that's better.
Go ahead. Yep.
Okay, I'm sure you're starting my time now. Chief Pick, can you please explain to the committee, going back to the limited harvesting opportunities for educational and ceremonial purposes, how you think the Alaska Department of Fish and Game should be engaging with you on this issue?
Well, as of right now, I asked for an application to fill out for a culture camp we're having this summer to teach children and students in our area survival skills and camp skills. And I haven't gotten a response yet, but they told me it sparked a huge discussion, which I'm not necessarily sure what that means. We were looking for a camp to take, for a camp permit to take 5 or 10 fish. But I think I'm not sure what they thought about it, but I still haven't gotten the permit, and that's where my concern has lied in having the state of Alaska being able to affect the potlatch take for ceremonial use of salmon.
Yeah, and I would, probably defer to the fact that we may have some different agreements, both treaty and by law through Canada to the States. But I think that your input's important, and I'm just wondering if maybe you're mentioning timelines and the timeliness of approvals and exemptions. I'm wondering if you've given thought to how these exemptions to the suspension of the fishing be developed and applied. Like, are there other recommendations we should be considering at this committee that might be helpful for, say, the Yukon First Nations and others?
Yeah, I think one thing that Canada could do is make sure that that those particular uses are protected on both sides of the border, and that language is stronger, because right now it says is at the discretion of the Department of Fisheries and Oceans in the state of Alaska.
That's very helpful.
And obviously, yeah, thank you.
And just going back to the kind of subsistence harvesting, can you just talk maybe about some of the externalities? I'm to understand that part of the blame was put there, but I just want to give you that opportunity to close out with some thoughts on that.
Short answer, please.
Yes, sorry. So I guess the responsibility of conservation has been put on the back of the Upper Yukon River for so long, and we just feel blamed consistently by the Canadian side and the state of Alaska managers for the decline in the fisheries when it wasn't necessarily our fault. We are not taking billions of pounds of biomass out of the ocean. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your time here. And congratulations again to your graduation.
Thank you, Mr. Green. We'll now go to Mr. Arnold for 5 minutes or less, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll go back to Mr. Wesley on some of your comments regarding other forms of mortality and there are more hazards in the marine environment and so on. And you also talked about having control over hatchery releases. Could you elaborate a little further on the hatchery releases? Are those releases in-river releases, or is Alaska State hatching fish and then releasing them actually in the ocean or in estuaries? Just to inform the committee a little on that, please.
Yeah. The Alaska perspective when it comes to hatcheries, the large hatchery programs in Alaska are of two species, pink salmon and chum salmon, and primarily in two regions of Alaska. So this is in South Central Alaska and in Prince William Sound, and then Southeast Alaska. So pink salmon are produced in Prince William Sound and chum salmon are produced in Southeast Alaska. And between those two species, it's over 2 billion juvenile fish that are not released in rivers. They are released in the near shore areas close to rivers, but they're actually purposely released away from major wild stock rivers. They're designed to be separate from those wild stocks. So there are no large scale hatchery releases into the Bering Sea from Alaska that would be interacting with Yukon River Chinook. The hatchery fish that Yukon River Chinook would be interacting with primarily would be Asian chum salmon from Hokkaido. And the data are really, really poor from Russia. It's really not clear what Russia is producing. Would be hatchery fish from Russia, places like Sakhalin Island in Russia. And then lots of wild production, wild chum salmon and wild pink salmon from places like Kamchatka. Those are what's competing with Yukon Chinook. So simply put, the Alaska releases of hatchery fish interacting with Yukon River Chinook, I think, is less of a concern, but hatchery fish in general in the Bering Sea in the North Pacific is an issue.
Okay, thank you. Can that be determined by sampling of the returning fish to the river? If those fish are out there for the same period of time they used to be and they're coming back smaller, I can see that there would be a correlation drawn there. Has that science been done? to see if the fish just aren't growing to size in the same amount of time, or are they being harvested before they become, or harvested or other mortality before they're reaching that large size? Which would it be, and has the science been done?
Yeah, let me speak to this very concisely. I've been involved in a collaborative project looking at the size of Alaska salmon of all the species we had information on from across all of the state. Over 12 million individual records of size of salmon, and all salmon across the species that we have information with have declined in size. Chinook salmon in particular have gotten smaller, and all of the salmon have gotten smaller, especially after about the year 2010. So 2010 was a real changing point for sizes. Things were kind of going up and down, but there was a precipitous decline in size. The answer to your question is that it is not that fish are just maturing younger. The older fish are being lost and are not surviving. So as fish grow, they potentially just could be growing faster, and then there's more food maybe, and they could mature younger. That is not what is happening. There's been a change in age structure that is likely tied to a change in genetics. The ocean, it seems like it is increasingly dangerous. Fish that are programmed to spend a lot of time in the ocean are not surviving, and we are losing those genes.
Okay, thank you. You talked about other forms of mortality, just briefly, because I think there's only about 30 seconds left. What other types of mortality would you suspect may be having a significant impact that we could pull a lever on and make a difference?
On the U.S. side of things, the Marine Mammal Protection Act has been incredibly successful. There's now way more nearshore marine mammals like seals and some other things that used to be harvested by local people. That's not nearly as happens anymore. There's way more seals than there's likely been in the ocean for thousands of years now because of the Marine Mammal Protection Act and because indigenous people have been displaced, erased off the landscape, and aren't harvesting marine mammals as much as they used to. That is something we have some control over.
Thank you for that.
Thank you, Mr. Arnold. We'll go to Mr. Hanley now for 5 minutes or less, please.
Thank you very much. I want to maybe clarify some of the perhaps discrepancies that we've been hearing on ocean bycatch, and I'm reflecting on when Steve Gotch from DFO talked to us, and he was referring specifically to Chinook bycatch, but he said the state of Alaska has very careful monitoring, and basically it amounts to a few hundred fish a year that is sort of documented bycatch, and yet we're hearing really from all three of you and from different angles that this is a serious and overlooked issue, and maybe it's related to the species, or maybe they're not monitoring everything. I wonder if each of you can clarify what you see or what you perceive about the relative importance of ocean bycatch. And again, I want to be thinking about solution focused and how we engage on this. But maybe I'll let you begin, Professor Wesley, on this.
Thank you. I actually wanted to speak towards this earlier. This is a very important question. This is my opinion based on everything I know around this issue. Is that when we talk about ocean bycatch, we are almost always talking about the pollock fishery and bycatch in the pollock fishery in the Bering Sea. And that there is I trust the data. I do. I absolutely trust the data. There are monitoring. There's people observing the catch on those boats. And so I think we have a very good handle on how many of those fish are being caught. So from that fishery, the pollock, and those boats are targeting walleye pollock, Alaska pollock. It's a massive fishery, and so they're not targeting the bycatch. The fishing industry does not want to be catching salmon. I assure you, they've been doing a lot to avoid salmon. That being said, the scale of the fishery is so large that you inevitably still catch some salmon. So despite all the technology, we can do better. We can move in time and space. those things should be looked at, but inevitably there are some fish that are intercepted and bycaught. So I just wanted to clarify that. So I do think it is really important. I also, on the record, do not think that the pollock bycatch is the cause of the decline of salmon in the Yukon. It's not, but it is certainly not helping. And I think one of my bigger concerns, and I can send this paper where we looked at essentially emulating a fishery of sorts that was selective on size like the pollock bycatch fishery is, you can also be favoring the maturing of younger fish. You lose the old fish that spend lots of time in the ocean because of the extra mortality that comes from bycatch. So there's things that are pushing all these fish to be smaller and younger, which we know has consequences, and the ocean is increasingly dangerous. And the pollock bycatch is one of those dangers.
Thank you, David. Would you want to add to that?
Yeah, I can sort of concur with what I've read, that management of bycatch, especially around Chinook, has been very an important part. I guess I want to bring up that it may not be the same for chum salmon, which are experiencing a decline, a dramatic catastrophic decline in the Yukon River as well, although, the evidence may not be there that these are chum from the Yukon River. But I think I agree with Dr. Wesley that I think that maybe there's there's big emphasis put on this. I don't think it's the primary cause in terms of the bycatch. It is wasteful and an unfortunate part of industrial fishing. Well, not unfortunate, it's a terrible part of industrial fishing, to be honest. But if it can be reduced, I'm all for that. And I think the various agencies in Alaska have been doing, some really good work, solid work to try and address that.
Chief Pitka, maybe you'd like to speak to this as well?
Yeah, just briefly. I agree with most of what Peter Wesley said. But also, I think one of the problems with bycatch is that they take out the food that the salmon eat also, along with everything else in the ocean. And then they degrade the whole ocean, bottom of the ocean. And they take so much out, and they're very non-specific. So even if they don't specifically take out Yukon River Chinook salmon, they take out the food that the Yukon River Chinook salmon depend on. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Henley. We'll now go to Mr. Perkins for 5 minutes or less, please.
I'll take the first few minutes, and then I'm going to share it with Mr. Perkins.
You go right ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I guess for all three members or witnesses here today, and I hope we can be nonpartisan to our home nations at this point, but the Yukon River salmon are going to require policy and regulatory change across international borders, this international border and possibly others. And do you feel that the U.S. and Canada have been collaborating effectively between themselves and with other nations that are affecting or potentially affecting Yukon salmon? Have they been negotiating or collaborating effectively, or is it the lack of that that has put us in a state of a 7-year moratorium? Chief Pitka, if you'd like to go first.
Yes, I think that the nations themselves could do a lot more work collaborating on this issue, especially with those other nations that I believe Mr. Wesley and Mr. Curtis mentioned. We need more information on the Russian hatcheries and the Asian hatcheries. And I think that, collaborating on those, on their fisheries would also benefit not only us, but them. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Curtis?
I agree with Chief Pitka and would also add that I think there is work to be done, continuing the good efforts and good work that's been established between the dialogue between Alaska and Canada and the fisheries and the people, the stakeholders. I think the panel has done some really valuable work, and the treaty itself might need to be revisited, I think, in relation to new evidence and new science as it becomes available. And I think the dialogue is quite strong. We're neighbors and we get along very well, I think. And, I think everybody's concerned about the same thing here.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Wesley?
Yeah, I guess ultimately I'm encouraged that the processes, think about the joint technical committees and the panel, Yukon panel, and the policies and the processes are there and in place. I'm encouraged by that. I guess I am disappointed by the most recent development where I think a well-intentioned, full lifetime moratorium biologically makes some sense. The process by which that was done, I think, has actually maybe hurt some of those relationships. I think there's room for rebuilding some of that trust. And so it's state, U.S. federal government, tribal governments, and Canada that all need to be equally at the table. And I don't think that equality and equity has been shown yet.
Okay, thank you very much. I'll turn my time over to Mr. Perkins now.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, witnesses. This has been really fascinating, and it's an important study. But I would like to move a motion that I put on notice, and hopefully we can deal with it quickly. We all know that recently we had quite an emergency crisis to deal with the closure of the crab and the lobster fishery in the Gulf related to a right whale sighting and the dynamic closure, which happened and was imposed by DFO initially, breaking the past policy and moving the dynamic closure into less than 10 fathoms of water. And I am happy that it was resolved, but I would like to move the motion I put on notice because I don't think we can afford to have this mistake happen again. So I move that in relation to Minister Diane Leboutillière's decision to backtrack on a lobster and crab fishing ban in waters less than 10 fathoms in LFA 23C, that the committee agrees to conduct a 2-meeting study to review the minister's decision and agree to invite A, stakeholders from the MFU, the Maritime Fishermen's Union, and B, Minister Diane Leboutillière, Fisheries and Oceans Minister, as well as the Deputy Minister, and that the witnesses be asked to appear before the committee for 2 hours each, and that such appearances take place before the committee study on derelict vessels, but begin no later than June 6th. And so that would be basically 2 meetings.
Mr. Cormier, you have your hand up.
Mr. Chair? Mr. Chair?
Yes. Go ahead.
Can you hear me, Mr. Chair?
Yes, I can hear you loud and clear.
Okay, thank you. Sorry. My computer was cutting off a little bit. Look, apologize for the witnesses that will have to go through this again. Look, Mr. Perkins could have waited at the end of the meeting to do that. Look, for the fishers and listen at home, I want to be perfectly clear that this member, on all the other conservative member or even the leader, never said a word about this issue the last couple of weeks. Not a word about this issue, this stressful issue and this terrible issue that we had to go through. That being said, Mr. Speaker, we want to get to the bottom of this issue. We want to know what happened during this crisis that we have to live for 1 week. This was a terrible mess by DFO official that our fishermen in my riding had to live through, and we want to get again to the bottom of this, Mr. Chair. But again, not a word from this member, not a word from the Conservative Party, not a word from the leader about this issue for the last week, and maybe just to get their little clip now and feel like they are the hero of the day. But Mr. Speaker, again, we want to get to the bottom of this, and we will have to have some amendment to propose on this motion also. So thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Cormier. We'll now go to Mr. Arnold.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to correct Mr. Cormier's statement that not a word was sent because a press release was issued from the Conservative Shadow Minister on this issue. And I would just like to make a small amendment to the end of Mr. Perkins' motion that the findings of the committee be reported to the House.
Okay. Thank you. Mr. Kellaway.
I'd actually like to move a motion to amend, if I can read that in.
Okay, we'll deal with Mr. Arnold's amendment first.
Any comments on that?
You going to read your amendment out? Or?
Oh. The amendment was just that at the end of the motion, June 6th, it should actually say June 6, 2004, and that the findings of the committee, or 2024, and that the findings of the committee be reported to the House.
So do we need to go to an individual vote, or is it unanimous consent for this? All good? Okay.
Yep.
Your amendment is carried. Mr. Cormier? Okay. Mr. Kellaway?
Yep, I'm going to then put the amendment, the motion to amend. I'll read through just what we're looking to replace, and then I'll do the usual, read it out very quickly. I move to amend the motion by replacing Minister Diane Leboutillier with the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, and replace ministers with departments. And this will make sure this is circulated around. Add other stakeholders as required. Strike Minister Diane Leboutillier, Minister of Fisheries, Oceans, and the Coast Guard. Add Adam Burns, Assistant Deputy Minister of Fisheries and Harbour Management, and strike, and that such appearances take place before the committee's study on derelict vessels, but begin no later than June 6th. So the motion would read that in relation to the Department of Fisheries Oceans decision to backtrack on a lobster and crab fishing ban in waters of less than 10 fathoms in LFA 23C, the committee agrees to conduct a two-meeting study to review the department's decision and agrees to invite A, stakeholders from the Maritime Fishermen's Union, and B, Annette Gibbons, Deputy Minister of the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, and Adam Burns, Assistant Deputy Minister of Fisheries and Harbour Management, and that the witnesses be asked to appear before the committee for 2 hours each. And we have a copy of this that can be circulated around.
Okay. Mr. Perkins?
I appreciate the Liberals' attempt to shield the minister from the decision that was made by her and her department that she had to go down and put toothpaste back in the tube and reverse her own decision. So I think she is accountable for the department last time I checked the Parliament. Obviously, you're trying to delay the urgency of this because this is the period of time where right whales are present up and down past Nova Scotia by Mr. Kellaway's riding in the Gulf of St. Lawrence as well. And we could have another sighting any moment now, and the minister could make the same mistake. So I won't be supporting the amendment for the obvious reasons that I just stated. One, it shields the minister, and two, it doesn't have an urgency attached to it in the need to get this done. I think we need to get this done ASAP before we have another major mistake by this Liberal government in this regard.
Mr. Morrison? You're pointing at the screen. Mr. Cormier? I can see the screen too. Here.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, again, maybe just to correct again my colleagues, look, the minister already commit next week to have the protocol measure for right rail review. On top of that, all the industry in my region blame DFO official for the mess that we had last week. Okay, so just want to put that on the record. So again, we want to get to the bottom of this, Mr. Chair. I do not agree with Mr. Perkins on what he just said about, the whales are here. Yes, they are here, but we already commit to review the measure. And on top of that, Mr. Chair, if you remember, this committee put a report together regarding the protection measure regarding the right whale. And this is what I want to know from DFO officials. Is the DFO official that never didn't retain one single recommendation of our report. There was some good measure in there, some good recommendation. And, I think the DFO official need to respond about what happened the past week here in my riding regarding the situation that we had with the whale.
J'aimerais rectifier mon...
I'd also like to correct a number of things. I believe the leader of the Bloc Québécois put 2 direct questions to the Prime Minister on this subject. He did it very quickly when things were heating up in New Brunswick. And we in Quebec are also very concerned because this is a problem that could repeat itself regularly around the Magdalen Islands and the Gaspé. On that, I would remind the committee that we had a roundtable on fisheries in December of 2022 and offered up a number of proposals to the department and the minister on a silver platter in 2022. In the light of the scientific data, Lynn Morissette, who was completing a study on cohabitation between fishers and the right whale. That was happening at the time. I would also like to hear the department's explanations, but I don't think the minister's absence would be constructive. I believe she needs to be there herself to at least hear what her department has to say. Thank you, Chair.
Mr. Arnold.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I also will be opposed to Mr. Kellaway's motion. We have asked the previous ministers multiple times, I believe, about who is ultimately responsible for that department, and the final decision comes down to the minister. So it was ultimately her decision that caused the chaos and havoc over this closure. And we need to hear from the minister about when she was considering this decision, was she aware of the unanimous report from this committee that we did on the study for the protection of right whales? And if not, why was she not aware? Those are questions that only the minister can answer. Her staff cannot answer those questions for her. So we need to have the minister. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Madame Desbiens said, well, some of the things I was about to say, but also I'll just add two more things. Just a reminder that while this incident was in MP Cormier's riding, the response affects all of our ridings depending on where the next sighting is. The mistake could happen anywhere. So it's not about the incident itself in that particular riding, but it is about the process that led to that. And I'll just remind Mr. Cormier, just as a correction where he said he was claiming it was DFO, unless the CBC is wrong, and far be it for me to criticize the CBC, I'm gonna quote the CBC article here. It says in quotes, "I can no longer defend my government on this issue," said Mr. Cormier. Last time I checked, my government, when it's done in the personal, is your government, the one that you're a member of. It doesn't say DFO, it says my government. So you laid the blame squarely at the minister's table, and that's why she needs to be here.
I think we have to separate the politics from the practical issue here. More and more what I've heard is a growing lack of confidence in the decision-making process at the DFO. The minister has to normally take the lead because she's not out on the water. She's not, in direct receipt of the data coming up. Of course, she's accountable ultimately, but I rather liked Madame Desbiens' suggestion that she should be here in the room, but the big bright light should be down on the DFO for the input that they gave her that led her to the decision that she ultimately had to retract. I think I would go directly to Madame Desbiens' recommendation and support that.
I apologise to Mr. Morrissey. He had his hand up before I went to Mr. Cormier, but when I went to go to Mr. Morrissey, he pointed at the screen, so I went to Mr. Cormier. I thought he was giving his time to Mr. Cormier, but back to Mr. Morrissey.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, it was Mr. Cormier had his hand up first, but I agree with my colleague, Mr. Hardy, and conversed with Mr. Cormier extensively when the situation was developing. And as Madame Desbiens clearly articulated, yes, ministerial accountability is there, but I am one that am increasingly frustrated with the decision-making process that comes within senior management of the department. And that's, Mr. Chair, where I want to spend the time. I agree with the two meetings. I believe the motion calls for 2 meetings with the senior officials that prepared the advice that was given to the minister. The minister can defend herself very well, actually, in the House and in committee. No doubt of that at all. She's quite combative and is quite prepared to challenge her own department staff. But on this one, Mr. Chair, I, for one, want to spend the time focused on the key officials that were responsible for providing the direction to the minister and how that information came about, where they received it, why it was so, not fundamentally, but totally flawed from what I understand, was given. And as well, as Mr. Arnold pointed out, this committee did a very thoughtful and thorough study on the situation of whales in the Gulf of St. Lawrence and the other region, because it's going to be with us. It's increasing, and it's actually moving. What region they will feed in will change depending on, or as quickly as climate change changes. The temperature of the Gulf as well as the feeding patterns in the Gulf. So everything I heard, I do not disagree with. Mr. Perkins as well articulated, but it can happen anywhere. Yes, we're only, what is the next sighting going to be? But beyond this one in Mr. Cormier's area, there was also a closure, I believe, in the Bay of Fundy. And then magically that whale, from what I understand, disappeared. And so then it was reversed. So the process has to be clear. Again, the committee, when the committee studied this, there was a wide variance between Canadian protocol on closing versus American. I want to know from the officials why we are sticking with the protocol that we have to shut down an area. And we cannot have a protocol, and I'm going to use the word maybe a bit strong, but frivolously closes a fishery that involves well over 200 fishers, their families, their lives, as well as the plant workers that are supported. So I very much look forward to the committee calling the witnesses that the committee identifies are responsible for the information process that led to the decision. Ultimately, we're correct. The minister makes a decision. In this case, she very prudently, when given different information, had no problem making a decision very quickly. That's on the record. I do not have to re-examine that, Mr. Chair, but I very much, as a member of this committee and as a member of Parliament from Atlantic Canada, want to hold accountable the senior management of that department that were responsible for the information, for maintaining a protocol for well over a year that didn't change after the committee did a thorough study and provided very thoughtful recommendations to the ministry on this, and why I don't believe any of it was adopted by the department officials. But again, the committee will choose by majority decision, but I prefer to focus my time, when we do get to this, on questioning at length the officials that provided the information that allowed the department to have a year lapse by since last year's incidents, and still had not adjusted anything as it relates to closure protocols based on the work this committee did and based on the information that's used by the United States. everybody, including fishers, and I was very impressed to watch a newscast where a fisher was interviewed and expressed at length their desire to ensure the protection of the North Atlantic right whale, and that they are supportive of fisheries that coexist between the two, between the industry and protecting the whales. So, again, I know the point. I know the point behind always reaching and bringing the minister in is to get clips in here with the minister. But on this one, I think if we're concerned about the industry, about the communities that are impacted, this committee will focus on the people that are engaged, the people that accepted the positions within the ministry to make the decisions that should be made, to make the decisions on assuring the information that gets to the minister of the day is the information that is 100% accurate, because these decisions have a tremendous impact, and that affect quite a few people. So, Mr. Chair, I will not support the motion as it was presented. I do support the amendment, which allows the committee to get quickly at examining the process that within the department that allowed to the decision.
Mr. Chair, can I call a point of order? Sorry, with all respect. Can I call a point of order, please? Point of order. Thank you. With all due respect to my colleague, I'm just wondering, Chair, if we should be considering the time and whether we should be letting our witnesses leave the meeting. It seems like this is going to be continuing for quite a while, and I'm unsure whether we will be able to get back to the witnesses. So to the Chair, I'm asking that we release the witnesses so they do not have to participate against their will to this debate. Thank you.
Mr. Curtis, and of course Chief Pitka, thank you for your appearance here before committee, albeit on Zoom, but in sharing your knowledge on this important topic as we were discussing. I'll let you sign
Mr.
off
Chair.
now instead of listen to...
Mr.
Yes,
Chair.
Mr. Henley.
Just before the witnesses go, since this is the last full study on this issue, and since every meeting has been interrupted by debate and out-of-scope issues, could I just ask if the witnesses have any further thoughts that they could please submit them in briefs to the committee so that it can inform our conclusions and recommendations? Thank you.
What I will do is I'll offer up to the witnesses if there's anything they've left unsaid, they can certainly send it in to the clerk and we'll include it in our study of the Yukon salmon. So other than that, I'll go to Mr. Perkins.
I'll just be quick because I don't want to be filibustering this out like it appears it's happening. But I'll just say that what I'm hearing from the Liberals is that the minister is not accountable for a department, and the department makes closures of fishing areas without her authority. I find that unbelievable, that the entire 2,000-kilometer area would have been closed without the minister approving that. So that's why she has to be here to account for those actions. And she can throw her department under the bus if she likes, but I'd like to see that happen in committee, and I'd like her to be accountable for why she isn't involved in those decisions.
Okay, Mr. Hardy.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. I think going into this, we need to have sort of eyes wide open as to what the process looks like, because I think one would assume that, an important issue like this would need the sign-off of the minister before something like a closure would take place. But, I'm informed that that's not the case, that, the DFO has the pen, if you want to use an old insurance term, to go in and mandate a closure. And it's only after the fact, in this case, that the minister, when she became aware of the situation and the dynamics, stepped in and reversed that decision. So, we might want to have that discussion about, the degree of sign-off that the minister should have in a situation like this, whether she should be given the option before a decision is implemented to say yes or no. But it appears that this case, she did not necessarily have that positioning on that decision. And so, we can have that discussion. Yes, Mr. Perkins, I agree. Which, again, takes me back to the reason why I rather liked Madame Debian's suggestion, is that the officials should be here with barbecue sauce behind their ears to hear exactly what we think about their process, their decision-making process. But the minister should be here to listen to the questioning that we have of those officials, because I think that, we've had this incident, but we've had other incidents where, the decisions are made and we say, where the heck did that come from? And, and they're reeled back in by a minister who just ultimately sees, that that decision by the department is not.
Point of order.
Excuse me. Let me finish, please. Let me finish, please. The issue here is.
We got a point of order, but we're running out of time too. So
I know.
We want the
So
votes
call
to be
the-
done this evening. We got to
Why don't we call the vote?
condense it.
I mean, we can have speeches at the when the minister's here.
Well, I've recognised everyone, I think, that's put up their hand, and I recognise Mr. Hardy, and I've got Mr. Morrissey on the list again. So, well, I think a lot of people have had the second go around.
There's two things that I think that have to be examined very, very closely, and I don't disagree with Mr. Perkins. First is the performance of the department, okay? The decision-making that they did, how they came up with the decision that they made, as well as the relative positioning of the minister and the influence she should have on important decisions like this. And it seems that there are disconnects there. And if there are disconnects there, then having the department officials in the room and the minister in the room gives us that opportunity to really straighten this whole thing out. I'll leave it at that.
Morrissey, you had your hand up.
Well, thank you, Chair. And just for clarification, it is not a second go-around, Mr. Chair. I was speaking, and I was interrupted by a point of order from Ms. Barron, which you correctly recognized, but I had the floor. Correct? Thank you, Mr. Chair. So, no, it's not a second go-around. I'd be the last one on here, on this committee, to be the least bit concerned or try to defend the current minister as ministerial authority. She will do that very well and very eloquently on her own. But I have a good sense of her perspective on the situation. And she would probably articulate it here in very few minutes, as her action showed when conflicting information was given to her by the fishers in the community. It was the fishers in that community that challenged the DFO information that was given, and I complimented them because they did it in a very peaceful, documented way, that they called into dispute the water depth that was being used by the department in the advice that it gave to the minister. So so that's the process, Mr. Chair, that I want to spend the time that this committee will have in examining how the department, how the senior people that were responsible for the decision made such an error, because as I understand, and possibly Mr. Cormier could correct me if I'm wrong, there was multiple maps that were being used that led to such a discrepancy in the water the water depth that led to the decision. So on that, nobody on this side is putting forward any concept or notion that takes away from ministerial accountability. And again, I would reiterate that there probably was ministers in the past that I may have accepted that for, but on this particular minister and in her actions since she's been the minister, does not shy away from ministerial accountability. And in fact, her actions, Mr. Chair, demonstrated that she is prepared to be accountable, and she made the decision when she was presented with information by fishers from the community that contradicted her own departmental people. So that's why my position is I want to spend the time that I have as a committee member in questioning the officials and ensuring we have the officials before this committee that should be held accountable and explain to this committee with the full powers that this committee has is how the information was collected that was presented to the minister, that based on that information, the minister made the only decision she could at the time. So again, it has nothing to do with ministerial accountability. Well, it has everything to do with ministerial accountability. It rests there. But it is the officials within this ministry that I want to spend the time that we have in getting some assurance or getting an understanding of how that decision was made, how the information was collected, and how it was confirmed within the ministry before it went to the minister. So, Mr. Chair, that's what I want to see this committee spend its time on. That's why I can only support the amendment to the motion, which will allow us to get to that and to get answers that the fishing industry want and deserve, Mr. Chair.
So, Mr. Chair, thank you very much. Look, just again to clarify something, the press release that was sent by the shadow minister, and this is probably why we called it shadow, because he was invisible on the party. The Conservative Party was invisible for a week. This was sent according to the Conservative website a week ago, on the 23rd, a week ago. So after everything was solved. So trying to take credit for something that was already dealt with is kind of a little bit funny. Pour Madame Desbiens, merci encore une fois.
Ms. Desbiens, thank you again for having successfully condemned what was happening in my region. I thank you for doing that. I believe that you also did very well
Kaplan.
when we were dealing with Kaplan in our region. What happened last week in my region is, as I've already said, unacceptable. Fishers in my region have attempted to make their voices heard by officials in Ottawa, but nobody has been willing to listen, in spite of many attempts, be it about the position of the whales, the depth, and the position is achieved with aerial surveillance. This makes it possible to follow the whales as they travel, but the department has never wanted to look at the data. Fishers in my region have done everything they can to act as responsibly as possible, not to fail in protecting the whale. They've done everything to make sure that there were never any altercations. Agents and officials in the region, with the agents and officials in the region, agents they've clearly explained how things were in the region, what was happening, but nobody's listened. Mr. Chairman, officials in Ottawa who are responsible for this issue must come before the committee to answer for what happened. Using 3 different marine maps, marine charts, to find a particular spot or gap is very unacceptable. We are using 3 different marine maps, and we might have ended up with something very damaging to the market. We don't even know what map we should be using. That's unacceptable. So we have to get to the bottom of things. We have to hear what happened during all these weeks, what the fisheries associations were doing and saying, particularly the lobster fishery representatives, but also the crab fishery representatives who've been dealing with this since 2017. They have to move their pots all the time. This is extremely stressful, and it has to be dealt with. The fishers in my region have demonstrated tremendous resilience, are now using traps that have no ropes. We are so far advanced in our whale protection measures. We are showing that we are doing everything we can. We're so advanced in modernizing fishing equipment. Lobster fishers, for example, are using new, more vertical cables, and that is much better for whale protection. So closing down an industry for 2 weeks, and it could happen again next week or tomorrow. We need to amend these measures as quickly as possible, and it can be done without us needing to fear losing our U.S. markets. We can work in cooperation with the industry. That is what is lacking at the moment, Mr. Chairman. There's no cooperation between the department and the industry. Officials aren't listening to the industry. So I hope we can get to the bottom of things. The minister has already made a commitment to review measures in place with the industry within the very near future, and that's what we'll be working on. We want amendments, and I do thank all my colleagues around the table. We came up with a very detailed report which contained excellent recommendations. None of those recommendations was taken into account by department officials, and I want to know why. There was an announcement, new equipment that could track the whales, like drones, for example. Why did department officials not even want to consider these solutions? We have been suggesting similar tools for a couple of years, tagging whales and so on. We've had experts telling us this could be done. So I do want to get to the bottom of things, Mr. Chairman, and I do want to see officials testifying before this committee to answer for something that could have been catastrophic for our region. The lobster industry is a $4 billion industry, and the loss over 2 weeks wouldn't be so bad. That's what the officials said, and I think that is terrible. I would very much like to hear them, and it's been 3 years that we've been asking for measures to be made more flexible.
That contains the talking list. I didn't see any more hands up. Where? It's 2 votes we have to have, and we got 4.5 minutes to get 2 votes done. So we'll do the amendment as per Mr. Callaway's amendment first. Yes, Mr. Morrissey.
Could we spend for a moment? No, we only have 5 minutes left, and he called the vote. He already called the vote.
You're voting on the amendment by Mr. Callaway first, and if that brings us back to the motion. Yes.
So, Point of order, Mr. Chair. I don't think.
Mr. Cormier, you were saying something?
Point of order. I don't think I don't think you called the vote, Mr. Chair. I said that we're going to vote on we're going to deal with the motion first. I don't.
Are you
Point of order?
Chair, he already called.
These points of order are not relevant to the fact that a vote's been called on the amendment.
I actually said we were voting on the amendment first, made by Mr. Kellaway. And the clerk is going to ask everyone.
Monsieur Cormier.
So are we voting on the amendment of Mr. Callaway?
Yes.
Yes.
Mr. Hanley.
Support.
Mr. Hardy.
Yes.
Mr. Kellaway.
Yes.
Mr. Morrissey.
Yes.
Mr. Arnold.
No.
Mr. Couric.
No.
Mr. Perkins.
No.
Mr. Epp.
No.
Madame Desbiens.
No.
Ms. Barron.
No.
Five yeas, 6 nays.
Okay, Madame Desbiens.
I'd also like to amend our colleague's motion, our Conservative colleague's motion, by adding Quebec Fishers Association to the witnesses who would appear.
I'm not getting the translation is really low.
Alors, je voudrais.
I would like, I can start again. I would like to amend the motion put forward by our Conservative friends by adding to the witnesses who should appear Quebec Lobster and Crab Fishers Association.
Another amendment from Madame Desbiens to amend the motion by adding the Quebec lobster fishers. So, yes, Mr. Hardy, Mr. Kellaway.
Mr. Hardy's a good-looking man, so to be confused with him is a great thing. I was going to propose
I
an
don't know
amendment.
who got insulted that time or who got the compliment.
Trust me, I'm not going to say. No, I think where MP Desbiens put forward an amendment, I have an amendment as well. So I guess we'll go through hers first and then mine.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Okay, we've all heard the amendment from Madame Desbiens. I'll ask the clerk to do the vote.
Monsieur Cormier.
Oui.
Mr. Hanley.
Oui.
Mr. Hardy.
Yes.
Mr. Kellaway.
Yes.
Mr. Morrissey. Mr. Arnold.
Yes.
Mr. Couric.
Yes.
Mr. Perkins.
Yes.
Mr. Epp.
Yes.
Madame Desbiens.
Oui.
Ms. Barron.
Yes.
The amendment is carried. Mr. Morrissey.
I believe our time may be out, and I would move we adjourn.
We're at 5:35 right now, so we'll have to leave the vote to the next meeting.
Thank you, Chair.
And,
Are we adjourned, Chair?
and with everybody's permission, meeting adjourned.
Thank you.
Yes, yes, that's what he should have put in the motion.
Thank you.